Thank you all for coming here today to spend your time and attention today talking about CCS and carbon management. For all of those of you who have been in the global CCS community for many years and are good old friends, it's good to see you again. And for all of you that are new or rather new to the carbon management community, please lean into the conversation today. We are all in this together. We've got a tremendous amount of work to do together as a global community. And so I'd love to set the scene and stage sort of in a global basis, again, just to frame our conversation for the discussions that Jess ran through in terms of the agenda for today. In terms of scaling up through 2030, consistent with all of the climate math, right? I think the global community is now realizing CCS is an instrumental part of an all of the above solution, right? And we've seen this in terms of the number of policies that are supportive of CCS, the number of projects that are growing on a global basis, and again, really catalytically over the last couple of years. The CCS project pipeline has exhibited strong growth, year-on-year growth, for 6 years in a row now, and is growing at a compound rate of more than 35% per annum since 2017. Again, much of this spurred by strong supportive government policies in a number of regions. As of March of this year, we are tracking over 560 facilities in the pipeline. There are 43 facilities that are operating with a capacity to capture and store 50 million ton per annum. So that's the operational facilities on a global basis. In the Americas region here, there are 260 facilities in development. There are 10 currently under construction and 24 in operation. And so if you look at a global map, a lot of the activity historically has been here in the States, and we see that trend continuing going forward. Growth has been driven by strong policy. If you look back how catalytic the Inflation Reduction Act has been, not just in the States, but on a global basis, I think many in the community really see that as one of those pivotal moments for carbon management, accelerating the deployment pathway going forward in recent past. And while all of this is wonderful to see, right, and certainly much stronger position that we've been in as a global community than several years ago, we still have much work in front of us. All the math says we need to get to gigatons of deployment, gigatons of point source carbon capture and storage, gigaton level of carbon dioxide removal, right, consistent with all the modeling and math to get us to net zero, to get us to 1.5 mid-century. Pick your framing. There's a lot of work that we as a community need to do still in front of us. And so this is the conversation, and hopefully the discussion we'll have today. How do all of us work together to achieve that goal, right? What's the appropriate role for governments? What's the appropriate role for industry? How does academia need to support this? How are we as a community going to build that next generation of operators and engineers and project managers, right? All of these low carbon technologies, just not CCS, are going to require that human capital to service this and get to that gigaton scale to help get us all to net zero. And so that's the conversation today. If you look back a couple of years, you know, how catalytic the United States policy with the Biden administration has been. Following the IRA, we see 200 Class 6 well permit applications that have been filed here in the United States. There are, as you can see on the slide, a huge number of facilities that have been added to our global pipeline just in the last couple of years, again, catalyzed by this policy development here in North America. CCS is now identified as a critical component in EPA's final rule for carbon emissions in the stationary electric power sector. Department of Treasury released final rules for accessing 45Q and 45V tax credits, so that's helping to move the polity surety forward. Department of Energy continues to put out that $12 billion from the bipartisan infrastructure law. On order of half of that has already been awarded, so $6 billion in awards. There's voluntary carbon dioxide removal purchasing challenge. There's a number of mechanisms that the federal government has they're putting in motion in spurring this accelerated progress we see here in the States. Department of State and Commerce just last week released the CCS handbook for policymakers in several languages, framed and focused at helping to accelerate carbon management deployment in Southeast Asia. And so there's a lot going on, again, spurred by government leadership and policy development. When you look globally across the project pipeline, you can see the sort of, hopefully, the exponential curve here in the data. And again, 43 facilities up and running, 50 million ton per annum on a global basis in terms of capture capacity. Just this calendar year, 5 new projects have entered into construction. And again, we're tracking this. It's a tough job to do, but we're adding several additional projects that are being announced on a weekly basis, on a global basis. Obviously, not all of those are going to come to fruition, but hopefully many of them are. And right now, if you sum those up, over 400 million ton per annum, 0.4 gigaton, we're starting to see that accelerated deployment toward what all the climate modeling and math suggests is the right level for CCS deployment. On a map, you can see where all of the activity is. Many of you in the room here know of all these projects in North America, in the States, in Canada, especially in the province of Alberta. But you can see the wonderful activity that is now progressing in Europe, activity in China, activity in Southeast Asia and Japan, and a fair amount of activity in the Middle East as well. There's a couple of projects that are being pursued in Brazil, which is wonderful. But again, you can see some blank spots on the map as well. And so as a global carbon management community, what do we need to do to help accelerate the curve to where we don't see projects? That's a good conversation for us to have in the room today and as we go back to our day jobs. If you look in terms of the application where we're seeing carbon capture and storage and where we're seeing all this project development activity on a global basis, there's a couple of things to take away from this slide. And this is from our last year's global status report. First of all, you can see the diversification of where CCS is being applied. Another point to look at the left-hand side of the curve, when we started doing carbon capture for the sake of enhanced recovery, that was over 50 years ago here in the United States, 1972. So there's now 8,800 kilometer, over 5,500 mile pipeline network here in the States, infrastructure to work with. But you can see as we progress in time, the application of CCS across a wider number of industries driven by the desire to help mitigate climate change. One of the other trends that we see is this focus on CO2 transport and storage as a business model that facilitates the development of hubs and clusters and networks. That's a fairly recent trend. We expect to see that continue as well on a global basis. None of this scales unless these projects are investable and can be financed on fair market terms and conditions and give an appropriate rate of return. And so one of the key strategies of the Institute is to, on behalf of the global CCS community, carry and help carry that conversation of how do we as the carbon capture and storage carbon management community engage with the finance sector? What conversations do we need to have together so that we can learn from each other and determine what's the most efficient way to make these projects investable? Given where the technologies are, given where the policy tools are, it's clear that this development that we're seeing, this accelerated deployment of CCS, is driven by strength in policy. How do we continue to leverage that? How do we continue to grow that and accelerate that on a global basis? We've seen in the last year or two some interesting trends in terms of investment in CCS companies. Some of you in the room here today, we hope this trend will continue. We expect this trend to continue. And we've also seen some merger and acquisitions in this space. A couple of notable ones are shown here on the slide. And most of the people I talk to in the finance sector that are following carbon management would expect this trend to continue as well as part of a normal growth trajectory for a relatively young industry that needs to scale on a global basis. And so as much activity as we're seeing, project debt financing still remains rare. And if we're going to get this to really scale to that gigaton level, this is where we need to go. There is no one business model. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. When you have these conversations here in the States, it's different than if you have it in the Middle East or if you have it in China or if you have it in Europe. But again, it all comes down to making these projects investable. Here in the States, and maybe I can just give a quick tour around the world just to set the scene for our discussions today. Again, we lead the facility count, if you will, in terms of the dots on the map, enabled by strong policy, including the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS and Science Act, all the tools that my former colleagues at Department of Energy have available to work with to help accelerate these early mover projects. And so the IRA increasing the dollar value of 45Q has been very catalytic. There's a number of other mechanisms that have been improved as well. And again, over $12 billion of taxpayer funding to help accelerate deployment of carbon management here in the United States, definitely a key driver. You can see also that other departments around the federal government are doing their part in terms of developing regulations for offshore storage. PHMSA is updating CO2 pipeline rules. The EPA, unprecedented number of Class 6 permit applications, over 200 well applications have been received, and we're broadening that regulatory responsibility, not just at the federal level, but North Dakota and Wyoming are issuing new permits as well. Louisiana recently received its primacy, and as just one data point, EPA awarded a first draft Class 6 permit in the state of California. So things are starting to move in a healthy way. Other regions in the Americas, again, the largest operating project in the Santos Basin, over 10 million ton per annum by Petrobras. They want to increase their operations moving forward. There are bills related to CCS regulations that folks in the community are progressing in Brazil. Many developing nations look to Brazil as leadership. And so as a community, whatever we can do to help support this will be much appreciated and a very good use of our time. Our neighbors to the north here in North America, in Canada, are doing their part. There are federal government policy tools that are put into play. There are accelerating awards in Alberta, recently awarding 19 additional hubs under their technology innovation and emission reduction regulation. And if you look back to the map, a lot of activity in Canada going forward as well. In Europe, their policies really, I think, took off after the Inflation Reduction Act here in the States. It catalyzed action not just here in the United States, but also in other regions, primarily in Europe, from my perspective. There are now more than 150 facilities in development in Europe. You can see sort of what the application is in terms of point source. Net Zero Industry Act, or NZIA in the European parlance, has a target to have 50 million ton per annum of storage developed by 2030, which is very quick, and seeks to shorten the regulatory timeframes. You can see also that the European Commission foresees on the order of 280 million ton per annum, over a quarter a gigaton, a capture capacity by 2040, and 450 million ton per annum by 2050. And so clearly, this needs a comprehensive policy approach. Clearly, there's a role for government leadership. Clearly, there's a role for industry action and leadership in Europe moving forward. It's been interesting to see the number of mechanisms and projects being supported through a variety of ways in Europe. There are now multiple bilateral agreements for moving CO2 across sovereign nations, and several of those were just announced a couple of weeks ago between onshore countries and Norway, as an example. In Europe, the storage under the North Sea still dominates all the conversation and all the project development, but it's interesting that some countries like Denmark and Poland are now also considering onshore CO2 storage for the sake of climate change mitigation. In the Middle East and Africa, we've seen really an exponential growth of activity there as well. Currently in the Middle East, it's about 8% of that total operating capacity. They have net zero targets. They're trying to diversify the overall economies. They're driving toward a decarbonized economy, 2045, 2050, depending on the country. You can see here on the slide, Oman's Ministry of Energy and Minerals is launching an initiative. The Institute is working to help support that, to move forward on CCUS. We're starting to work with colleagues in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE. There's a tremendous amount of activity. Large project activity is progressing in the Middle East. Just one example in Al Jubail in Saudi Arabia. Several years ago at the COP, the Minister of Energy from Saudi Arabia and the President of Aramco stood up and said, we are going to operate and stand up a large CCS hub and cluster. Full-scale operation, 44 million ton per annum by 2035, but we're going to have the first phase up and running, 9 million ton per annum by 2027, and they're working to do that now. And so a lot of strong growth in that region. And then in the Asia Pacific, all of the climate modeling and math suggests this is where much of the increase in energy demand, energy services demand, and hence potentially emissions are going to grow moving forward. We need CCS, carbon management, to decarbonize that. And so we are tracking and trying to support accelerated deployment of carbon management, carbon capture and storage in the developing regions in Asia as well. In China, very quietly over the last couple of years during the pandemic, tremendous progress at scale in China in terms of application of CCS on point sources. 3 projects became operational last year. China Energy now operates a 500,000 ton per annum capture on a best-in-class coal-fired power plant in the stationary electric power sector. They started up their first offshore CO2 storage facility and another carbon capture project as well. And so you can see the number of projects that are going forward. These are now up at the megaton level. Huaneng Energy, one of the large generation companies, is under construction now of a 1.5 million ton per annum, fully integrated from day one, capture on a coal plant, new build. That'll be operational probably November of this year. So again, the data point, the takeaway message for China is it's getting larger and they're moving at speed. They started up their first dense phase CO2 pipeline last summer, 109 kilometers in length, and that was taking CO2 from their first megaton per annum project started up by Sinopec a little bit before that. In Japan, they have a CCS roadmap integrated, driven by their ministry, METI. They are supporting 7 CCS projects that will capture CO2, either in Japanese waters for storage, or there's a couple of those projects that would go offshore to other sovereign nations. And they have a roadmap that projects on the order of 120 to 240 million ton per annum of carbon management by mid-century to help decarbonize Japan. Also in the Middle East, in Asia Pacific, a number of other developing countries are engaging in the conversation. Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Brunei, Timor-Leste, some of them were here with the work that was done under Department of Commerce to learn from each other through the community, but a tremendous amount of project activity and policy development is occurring in many countries in the Asia Pacific region. And in Australia, the federal government is leading some work looking at London Protocol. In Southeast Asia, around Australia, there is much interest in shipping CO2 as part of that overall integrated value chain from capture, transport, and storage, dedicated geologic storage. And so there's an interest to facilitate transboundary movement, bilateral, multilateral agreements to ship CO2 in the region. And so all of this coming together, right, is wonderful, again, from where we were several years ago as a community to where we are now. Tremendous accelerated progress driven by strong policy, much of that here by the Biden administration and Congress, the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law. A tremendous increase in the number of data points that we're tracking. But all of this gets us to hundreds of millions of tons per annum, and the climate math says we need to get to gigaton level. Right? And we realize all of the projects that are on paper now are not going to go forward, but hopefully many of them will. But there is still a tremendous amount of work that we as a community need to do together to up the game, to accelerate deployment, to broaden deployment, to get to these regions on the map that I showed earlier that there aren't a lot of dots yet. Right? How can we as a community, how can the Institute as just one organization in our community work together to do that work and move forward in a good direction? It's interesting that I've got bagpipes in the background here. But again, that's where it's all about, right? There's clearly a leading role for governments to play to drive that policy. I was a government guy at Department of Energy for several decades, right? That screams a government role, and you see a number of governments standing up to drive that within national borders and then collectively through mechanisms like the Carbon Management Challenge, the Clean Energy Ministerial, other mechanisms where multilateral government activities can efficiently and effectively help people work together to speed the curve and to accelerate deployment of CCS. So hopefully with that, I've given you a bit of an overview of where things are globally. We've got a lot of good work to do together. And that's what conversations like today are about, right? The focus is going to be here in the States, but again, this is a global remit, this is a global problem. We're all in this together. The Institute hopefully has the agility to be a helpful resource to all of you as you work to progress your projects. If we can be helpful, that's a conversation that we want to have any day of the week. So again, I invite all of you to lean into the conversation today. And again, let's make this day as productive as possible to learn from each other throughout the rest of the conversation. So thank you for the attention. And I think we've got a couple of minutes if anybody has any questions for me in terms of broad global perspective or anything else. Steve Winberg.
Garrett, nice presentation. On the China piece, they committed that in 22 and 23, something in excess of 200 gigawatts of coal-fired generation. Do you happen to know is that abated?
Yeah, so the question from Steve Winberg, former Assistant Secretary of Fossil Energy, right, was in China. China has permitted and is moving forward with hundreds of gigawatt of new coal-fired power generation. And the question was, is that unabated or abated? And I think if you look at, China's climate policy, they have a N+1 or a 1+N climate policy, right? They've got a 2030 and a 2060 where they want to have peak emissions 2030 and get to net zero at 2060. Most of China's stationary electric power is derived from coal. Most of that is unabated at the moment. What we're seeing is, and again, there's 5 generation companies, or what, Holly, 4 or 5 now, from consolidation, that form the bulk of China's electric power company landscape. The leading ones are moving to abatement now. And so China Energy, which is the world's largest power company, the world's largest wind power company, the world's largest thermal power company, the world's largest mining company, I believe, all rolled into one state-owned enterprise. They started up last June capture on one of their best-in-class high-efficiency new coal plants, 500,000 ton per annum. They have plans to move forward for full capture, right? China Huanong, one of the other large power companies, is under construction now of a fully integrated CCS, fully integrated in a new coal power plant, 1.5 million ton per annum capture. That'll be starting up and shake down by the end of this calendar year. I believe November is what it's targeted. So as they move forward, I think they are looking to decarbonize and roll that in, but there is no government policy like we have in the States to provide certainty in a business model in the Chinese context yet. So I know that is part of the conversations bilaterally between the current administration here in the United States and the current administration in China. How can we work together to accelerate that in terms of application of CCS on coal in China? And then the question is, how can the United States and China, as 2 of the largest economies and emitters of the world, help share that and leverage that to deployment on similar opportunities on a global basis?